All right, welcome, good afternoon. Everyone have a nice lunch? Awesome. We're gonna do our best to keep you awake. We're gonna talk about awesome stuff like compliance. How's that sound, right? No, we think this is really, really cool stuff. I wanna welcome you to the Governance at Scale and Compliance Automation Talk. My name is Brett Miller. We have Brian Webster here from Trend Micro, and we're gonna discuss some really cool patterns that we figured out over the last year and a half working with some large customers in both commercial and public sector, and having to deal with a lot of compliance-related issues as you scale into AWS. A lot of things that work well when you have just a couple accounts become problematic as you scale into AWS and go faster and faster. So we want to talk to you about this blueprint that we've created called Governance at Scale, to kind of share some of our experiences and some of the patterns that you can use and think about how you deal with governance as you go faster and faster into AWS. So we hope that you guys get something out of it and take this back to your organizations and start thinking about some of the ideas that we're talking about today. So when you get to these questions, you'll have some answers for your organizations and your leadership.
So a little bit about how we got here today. Out talking to customers, Brett and I both all the time spending time with customers, and we see this pattern that repeats over and over and over. You have a development team and they go stamp out of EPC and it works really, really well for them. And a second development team comes along and they build a little bit different architecture. I got two of these and that's not too bad to manage. And then I've got a third one that comes along, or maybe IT designs a standardized architecture for another team. And suddenly these very easy to manage, very clean designs on the left side of the screen here start to look like this mess on the right side of the screen. And as more and more teams adopt AWS technologies and look for all of the advantages of moving quickly, iterating, providing more value to agencies, departments, organizations, development teams, product lines, the ability to manage those, to have visibility, to understand what my risks are, and to be able to assign some controls to that environment becomes increasingly more difficult.
So being at AWS for about 3.5 years and traveling across both commercial and public sector spaces, the questions we get from customers become very familiar and a pattern that we've seen over time. And as they scale into AWS and start going faster and faster, we see the same themes over and over again. You know, one of the major themes is, how do I determine the current status of cloud users and their access rights as I scale, right? As I create more accounts in a multi-account strategy that can span, even hundreds or even thousands of users, how can I ensure that all of my account rights and everything is kosher as I get larger and larger and things are moving faster and faster? Another big question I hear over and over again, especially in the public sector, is how do I adhere to the IT budgets in a pay-for-use model? Right? As I grow out and I have all these developers making micro purchases, how can I make sure that they're not exceeding their budgets? I need to be able to manage accounts very much aligned to the way I normally would appropriate IT budgets, and then have a system that can automatically manage those budgets and constraints as I grow into a couple of accounts all the way to thousands of accounts. So that's actually something that we've heard over and over again. Has anyone experienced that at all, or have those types of questions inside of your organization? A lot of people do, right? It can be challenging. Once again, we see a lot of customers when they're very small use spreadsheets and manual methods, but as you scale out, you really need to figure out how to create an automated system to manage that in a very familiar fashion that your leadership is used to seeing. And then, of course, the other thing is about, if I scale out, how do I ensure that all of my accounts and all of my applications are compliant with legal and regulatory and contractual policies, right? As you get bigger and bigger, it's very hard to use the same manual processes in order to ensure that your accounts and your applications are maintained within those baselines. So these are very common questions that we hear every day. And on kind of a lower level, how do you ensure that the security posture of all these accounts and all these applications are enforced through accounts and workloads. And of course, all of this questions is, how can I do all of these things without reducing the agility that the cloud provides, right? These are very common themes that we kind of tackled starting about a year and a half ago for both a commercial and a public sector customer, and developed these patterns and themes we want to share with you, and how you could answer some of these very important questions as you go back to your organization and you figure out a strategy on how to scale into AWS.
So back to that first diagram, that first drawing, how do we end up in this spot? So we see the typical adoption rate for enterprise and for public sector organizations is the primary driver to get into the public cloud is the agility afforded to application teams. So it's the teams who really want to drive value to the organization. They're at the bottom of the organization. These are the parts of your team that really want to get access to these services and start to be able to deliver faster value, faster iterative technologies. At the same time, and often unfortunately a little bit late to the game, we have a centralized IT organization that has a job to do, managing risk for all of my infrastructure, providing security controls, providing reporting up to my management, to my executive leadership, and it's really their job to, at some point, figure out how to box these organizations in a way that makes sense, hopefully without reducing the speed that these teams can work at. So what we really want to get to is a governance model that meets the organizational requirements for managing that risk, hopefully something that we can map easily back to the types of controls that we've been running on a premise infrastructure, and to a business model that a hierarchical organization with many levels of depth, both in reporting and in budget allocation, can manage, will allow us to scale very widely, very quickly, very repeatedly, and allow direct access to the APIs and services that teams have come to rely on. That's what drove them to AWS in the first place, and continue to drive the flexibility and innovation that they provide. One of the early ways that IT teams really tried to get into this governance model and boxing in developers was to look at something like a cloud broker approach, or something like AWS's own service catalog. These are really, really cool services where we have an abstraction layer maybe that just hides portions of functionality for the end users or consumers of the service to make sure that they're not using anything that they're not supposed to. But it's really kind of a whitelist sort of capability, right? So we have to expose those services explicitly in the brokerage platform. Or in the case of Service Catalog, which is fantastic for, I'll say, less sophisticated users or teams that aren't worried about the underlying infrastructure. Anything where we have a standardized application template they're just going to consume, like a standardized web page, or maybe it's a wiki platform. Let them go to Service Catalog. They can click the button. They don't need access to the underlying operating systems. They don't need to know anything about that infrastructure except for an exposed endpoint that they can consume and leverage. Couple of drawbacks to these approaches, the primary one being we've lost that agility. Right? So if, for instance, a new service comes under the BAA for AWS in a new region, now I need to go make a change to my brokerage platform in order to enable a developer to use that service. If I have a new API that platform team needs to be able to consume in order to do their job, in order to continue moving quickly, now I need to go make change to a management platform that enables that capability, or I'm going to have to go create a new application stack or a new cloud formation stack in order for them to be able to deploy that capability and consume it. So what we really want to get to, again, is we want these minimally encumbered AWS accounts. We want developers to have the flexibility that drove us all to come to an AWS summit in the first place, to consume these services and to rapidly provide value. But we need to find a way that gives a little bit of guardrails. We need to be able to understand repeatably that organizations can't leverage services. They can't create systems which are outside of policy. We don't want end users running amok with administrative rights or logging in with root accounts and no MFA. And we need to be able to provision these in a way that we can start to use this as the basis for how we build our reporting infrastructure. And to get to a bottom line of repeatably deployed and automated security controls while still giving that flexibility. So again, a little bit more detail on the first drawing. So why does it matter if I have 10 different design patterns, each stamped out 50 times. So in the beginning, I had a couple of accounts with a couple of teams. Each of them used slightly different services. They're logging directly into IAM on each machine. It looks pretty easy to manage. Right? I only have 2 accounts. I only have a couple of users. I only have 1 extra service, right? So I can apply the same controls just twice to EC2 instances and to my S3 bucket policy. And those extra guys over there using RDS, we can figure out what to do for that one-off. By the time I hit tens of accounts, and especially by the time I hit hundreds of VPCs and accounts, this mapping of how do I stamp my IAM policy across each of these accounts consistently, this becomes incredibly difficult. Especially coming in for an IT organization after the fact where this is already the case. Right? I already have 15 different copies of IAM policy for my standard developer, and I already have 30 sets of standard S3 bucket policies to manage across the environment. Trying to come back and unify these with many services, multiple accounts, and numerous application teams creates significant challenges for IT organizations attempting to put guardrails around or figure out how to manage some risk and reporting for compliance in their environment.
And one thing we've learned through working with a lot of customers, one governance model doesn't fit them all. We've seen a lot of organizations try to figure out, one way of handling all applications across the enterprise. And what they get back from their developers is that it doesn't give them the agility that they need, right? You can't just take maybe a high water approach to say this is the way governance is going to be done, these are the controls that are going to be implemented across the board, because every app is a little bit different. The data is different. The impact levels are different. So we found out through working with a lot of different customers that the governance model, as you guys grow into AWS, needs to be tailorable. It needs to have a tune button, right? So for workloads that are around developers, you need to be able to turn it down, right? You need to be able to give them more agility and less controls so they can utilize the platform to its highest degree. But on the other end of that spectrum, you may have high impact workloads that need a higher level of governance. So it's important to be able to tune that once again back up in a very programmatic way, not through manual methods or help desk tickets, but actually on the fly be able to create these policies that can be implemented by managers through GUIs and web interfaces in order to easily turn up and turn down this governance model. This will ensure that, one, the developers have what they need to be successful and they don't feel like they have handcuffs. But in the situations where you need high-level security, you have the level of security that's necessary to protect the data and the applications to whatever the organizational thresholds are. Very important aspect for doing that. And so we want you guys to think about that as you actually build your own web interfaces and scale out into the cloud. Working with a couple major customers over the past year and a half, we came up with this governance at scale pattern that we believe can really help customers scale efficiently and with confidence into AWS. These incorporate all of the challenges we hear over and over again, and so we basically created this pattern to encompass 3 major pieces of governance at scale that are based on the challenges that we've seen across public sector. One is about account management, right? In a lot of organizations, account management and getting accounts is very hard. It's very manual driven. And it sometimes can take up to 6 weeks to get an account. In order for governance at scale to work, we encourage people to automate the account provisioning process, right? Create the web interfaces that developers can go into and request accounts, and then their managers can approve the accounts, so on and so forth. We'll go into that in more detail in the next couple slides. Cost enforcement, right? If you're going to scale out and be able to programmatically create accounts to allow developers to go very quickly, you're also going to have to automate a lot of the cost enforcement. That means actually being able to apply budgets to accounts and groups and projects, and then have the system automatically enforce those, and even in some cases, enforce it through code and IAM that's dynamically to stop people from going over their budgets. It's a very important mechanism as you scale out, and have even up hundreds or even thousands of accounts into AWS. And the third one that's important, and as you scale, is to automate compliance, right? There is no way that a lot of developers can become very agile in AWS and still be constrained by the traditional compliance processes that have governed IT systems over the last 10 years. So you work with companies like Telos Exacta in order to automate the entire compliance process. So not only do you provision accounts very quickly, but you can also put in the plumbing to automatically provide compliance artifacts that you need in order to get an ATO into AWS. Very important part of a governance at scale solution. So what does this look like? So at the end, if you can implement a web tool that looks like something that is very natural in a large organization, right? A large organization wants to manage cloud just like they manage their traditional IT environments and budgets and compliance. They want to have different views at different hierarchies of the organization. They want different views to what the executive wants to see about all of their accounts, all the way down to managers that actually manage those individual budgets. And all of this is managed through automation, right? In a web interface that each view has its own window into all of the environments and can implement policies very programmatically and very easily that can actually be tailored down to a hierarchy of an organization.
We look at sometimes the difference between compliance and security. There's a fundamental view difference in the organization. Managers are very concerned with budget. Project managers are very, very concerned with the checkbox for FedRAMP or for PCI and to ensure that they're within regulatory compliance. And we love the advantages that we can have with this type of automated approach to continuously assess that. I've yet to really meet a project manager that's super concerned with the status of AV on a box. Is it compromised or not? They might be pretty concerned with. But an analyst is probably very, very concerned with the status of a security group for a particular part of an application team. And we really need to work to be able to provide the same type of segmented visibility so that an analyst has all of the level of detail that they need, easily isolated by the project type so that their visibility is scoped to the problem at hand, and so that they don't have to worry about projects that aren't their problem. And then by the time we step up a level and we start talking to the levels of management who just need to know which of my projects are doing this right, which of my projects are doing this wrong. At the end of the day, that's what I hear from most customers at a project management level or even at a middle management level is, I don't want to know the pluses or minuses. I don't want to know these little details. I want you to tell me which teams I need to get more help for, right? By the time we roll that up to the next level of management, I don't really want to know anything about the project. They want to know, what's my percentage? Of the teams that are under my purview, are 50% of them doing their jobs right? Or 50% of them have all of the tools that they need to make sure that security is out of their way and that my risk is managed? Or are 75% of my teams in a little bit of trouble and I need to either find them some extra resources, figure out how to do better integration, or go talk to my automation team and find out what extra capability I need to make sure that these developers are protected, that my risk as an institution is being properly managed, that I'm in compliance with corporate security policy or the department or agency security policy. So I've worked for a couple of CFOs, I've worked for a couple of CIOs. I've never once had them ask me about a project or a percentage. They want to know, when I go to my board, are we good or are we not good, right? How do I get this roll-up of visibility so that all of this aggregated data across tiers, across disparate projects, across a range of operating systems, different types of workload controls? Brett mentioned, one size doesn't fit all. I'm going to guess that a developer can't probably work very fast if I put application control on their development instance and turn it on lockdown mode so that they can't create any new applications and run them to test them. How do I take all of that information and roll this up into a package that can be consistently delivered in a metered, measured, known, consistent way across all of my reporting hierarchy?
All right, so let's talk a little about more account management. It's one of the kind of the pillars or foundational elements of what we've created as pattern for. What we found out that really works as you create a multi-account strategy and you want to use programmatics or AWS organizations to programmatically create an accounts. One of the really good ways of doing this is to create an administrative account, right? You have all your users of your organization live into this account, right? And from this jumpstart point, they can actually automate account provisioning. They can join other accounts. This entire web interface that you can actually build will allow the developers to quickly go into these accounts or create new ones. You know, a developer can go in and say, I have a new account. Please allow me to start testing Lambda. Make a request. The request goes up to the manager, and then automatically you can provision that account and then apply all the appropriate baselines to make sure that account is within the constraints that the organization wants to imply across the entire organization. So in this way, it gives developers what they need, in other words, accounts when they need them, but it also allows a lot of the organization through programmatics to baseline the security of those accounts, to make sure that everything is configured to organizational standards so they can get their account, but it also is configured correctly and then can help ensure that they are staying within their organizational security controls. One of the ways that we tell people to do this is if you're going to programmatically create accounts, a really great idea is to take our enterprise accelerators and use them as the baseline for all these accounts. So a developer can go in, create an account, and then automatically those accounts will be baselined with all the appropriate best practices and security to make sure it stays within those constraints.
Excuse me, what does MFA mean?
Multi-factor authentication. It's a best practice in AWS, so we recommend that all accounts that are created, you actually enable MFA, especially for sensitive workloads and accounts. So how does this actually work, right? You would take all of your users, put them in a set of accounts, and then from that account, you can create web interfaces to allow developers to actually request a new account. That account can then be created and then baselined to the appropriate security. If it's a developer account, you may have very little security. If it's a high-level workload, you may want to have more security. But the idea is you can programmatically create accounts and then baseline them and then provide those users or those groups of users the appropriate permissions to get into those different accounts. This provides a very, very dynamic ability to be able to give developers what they need when they need it, but also ensure that the proper permissions and all of the security controls are in place on day one when that account is created. It could be created for a day, or week, or even a year.
So we start to look into, we said we're going to baseline these accounts. What are we actually talking about? What we're looking to do here is to be able to set the critical controls that need to be standardized across an organization at provisioning of the account or of the VPC. We want this done from day one. We don't want there's never been a human being that's ever interacted with an environment, and we already know that we have critical sets of controls, critical sets of audit requirements, and documentation of those audit requirements existing as the environment is created. We can tie these back into reporting implementations so that we have documentation on day one that config rules have been created to ensure the ongoing compliance of an environment before the environment could have been touched, right? We can look and know from the code that provisioned an environment that IAM policies commensurate with the environment already exist, that roles have already been created, that we didn't create any users, and then we have all of the audit controls and logging necessary through CloudWatch and then backups through S3 to understand that no user could have ever logged into this account before we would have had an audit trail of any misdeeds that were done. Especially by the time we get into VPC and start looking at VPC peering, network CIDR allocation, we start to see some really big benefits to this type of model beyond just the compliance standpoint and the security aspect. One of the things that we find over and over again, most developers I talk to really aren't very worried about CIDR blocks and how to create subnets and how to arrange a network and how to set up BGP. They really don't want to spend a whole lot of time trying to figure out how to connect one VPC to another, or how to get a route back to Direct Connect to be able to leverage premise resources or shared infrastructure resources that might be hosted in other AWS accounts. As we get to a place where we can provision these things for the application team, we can add third-party operation tools like deep security and automate provisioning of security tools onto every individual EC2 instance. Suddenly developers feel a little bit less like they're being put in boxes, a little bit less like their freedom to innovate is being restricted, a little bit less like they're being handcuffed, and a little bit more like time's being given back to them. Like, we're actually doing things now that enable them to do more work faster, sooner, and actually focus on driving value and innovation for the mission instead of worrying about network facilities and security policy. Really critical part of this, just like having config rules and IAM policies and roles and CloudTrail configured at provisioning of the implementation of the infrastructure, is to have the operation stack and security tool set provisioned immediately. You have a tool that you can integrate and give visibility to your security product as the account is being created. You gain an immense amount of confidence in your ability to audit an environment. So this is an example of in code, an IAM role or a user being created and then immediately making an API call to the deep security management plane. So the deep security management plane has a full inventory of all EC2 assets in a brand new account that no one's ever logged into, and will always sync those EC2 instances, bring them up as they're created in EC2, destroy them as they go away, and always have a complete audit trail of the environment.
So another principle of governance at scale is cost enforcement at scale. We find out this is extremely important to a lot of public sector customers. So we encourage to automate that as well, right? Use automation to map AWS accounts to an organizational structure. So all of the accounts are in a hierarchy that's very familiar to an organization in the way they allocate budgets. A CFO should be able to allocate a certain amount of his IT budget to his VPs, and his VPs should be able to allocate funds to managers, and then those managers can actually push those to different projects that are in AWS and have the entire system automate and enforce those budgets without having manual people looking into accounts or having to go into alerts in their emails that people are going over their budgets. Everything should be automated. So we encourage to use the APIs and create a web interface so you can make cost enforcement and budget alignment very natural to a large organization, so it doesn't feel like you're doing something different for cloud versus the way they treat IT budgets going forward. In both of our pilots that we've done, this is a very familiar interface, and it just makes sense because that is the way a lot of organizations will manage their budgets in IT. What does it look like? Well, you should have a web interface in order to provide different views of cost and how it's being allocated in a large organization. You should have different viewpoints and different ways to allocate new funding sources at different levels of the organization, and then be able to push budgets down to the different leaders, all the way down to projects, and then have automation manage those budgets. And then have automation on top of it not only look at those budgets, but alert when certain thresholds are met, or even do enforcement, like stopping people from using more EC2 if necessary in order to stay within their defined budgets. But the idea is not to use spreadsheets, but actually use automation itself to align a budgetary process that's familiar to an organization that you typically see in public sector.
Really the first time I had to have a conversation with my R&D teams and my customers about a security tool, and then security tools features around budget and cost, it was a little bit of a sad day for me. It wasn't my favorite thing in the world to do. It makes absolutely perfect sense. We run around in industry for years selling seats of licenses. And now I'm going to go to this model where I have instances that come up, come down. I have projects that are going to projects that are going to go away. I have budget allocation that's being distributed from the CIO down to different VPs, now allocated to different project managers, and then down into individual projects. How am I supposed to shuffle where those seats go as new instances come up, go away, they're turned off to save money at night? How do I get that done? And it's, at the end of the day, it seemed very, very simple. Customers said, your product needs to not charge me when I'm not using the instance. Why would I pay for security for something that's turned off? It doesn't really make any sense to me. And when it comes back, you need to get updated. You need to send any logs that you had. You need to notify me that you're still maintaining the correct security posture. And at least as importantly, I'm going to guess from probably some ugly scars along the way, if I turn off an instance, don't tell me about it. Don't complain that you haven't checked in. Don't complain that the security policy might not be correct because we haven't heard from it in the 8 hours that it was turned off while a developer's sleeping instead of writing some code. This is really important to being able to sanely manage distribution of this cost analysis. So now when managers trying to look at a budget for project 1, project 2, project 3, they're paying for their security spend the same way that they're paying for the instance that's on, right? And it becomes very easy to tie the runtime for that instance back to the runtime of the security control and understand really quickly what my posture is and how I'm paying for that security control or any other ops tool. This has been a huge, huge thing for a lot of our customers to be able to manage a security product and pay for a security product the same way they manage and pay for their EC2 spend.
All right, the third important aspect of governance scale, what we learned from a lot of our interactions with some customers over the last year and a half is once again around compliance automation, right? If you are going to be able to programmatically create accounts that could be, you could create 10 accounts, 20 accounts, even 100 accounts, you got to automate a lot of the compliance of all those individual accounts, right? So the leadership understands how things are configured and also help them create the documentation that's necessary to get an ATO. In our pilot programs, we're incorporating Telos 360 in order to provide this function, right? As an account comes up, you're going to be able to programmatically plumb Telos 360 into these accounts, automatically pull out security configurations of those individual accounts, and then create all of the artifacts that are required for the auditors or even the authorizing official. It's a really good way of programmatically doing a lot of the heavy lifting that we currently do in manual ways today to be able to use a system like Telos Exacta to plumb into a programmatic interface to create SSPs and documentation on the fly. So what does it look like? What do customers want to see? Well, they want to see different views, just like you saw with account management and cost enforcement, but around compliance, right? An executive wants to see how all the systems under his purview meet all the different compliance frameworks that they are required to meet. So in this case, an executive wants to make sure that all his FedRAMP systems are compliant, all of his PCI systems are compliant, and the system will actually roll up a compliance dashboard to give them a real-time view of how things work. This is a critical piece that's going to provide the confidence for people to go into scale. And in our situation, we're using, once again, Telos Exacta to provide all of that plumbing and the reporting to actually provide that level of compliance visibility to whatever level in the organization actually needs it.
The same way that we want to ensure that every time we build out an account, that we need visibility for our operations stack, we need inventory management, we need an audit trail before any human ever touches the environment. I want the exact same set of controls for my organizations tailored to a workload every time an EC2 instance is launched. Right? Everything inside of that instance is my organization's responsibility in the shared responsibility model. I'm going to hope everybody's heard of the shared responsibility model because we forgot that slide. Every time an instance comes up, it's going to be a little bit different. I don't know what a developer is deploying into it. Unless you've got some intelligence in a product or in your orchestration layer that it can actually look inside of an instance, understand what applications are there, what versions of those applications, what vulnerabilities are in those applications that might be remotely exploitable, and then be able to assign rules and policies that protect that copy of that instance, regardless of what was done to it with user data or cloud init or CFN init or Chef or Puppet while it's being deployed. To be able to scan that workload, automatically create a policy, and then automatically assign that protection and turn it on is a huge step in automation. We also at the same time, just the same way that while provisioning accounts, we want to take work away from our developers. We don't want developers to have to be worried about network connectivity. We don't want developers to have to be worried about implementing the same config rules over and over and over again. I don't want developers to really be worried about security policy. I want to give developers a static set of code that I can give to every single team that they can include in their Jenkins build, that they can assign a tag to an EC2 instance that lets Chef know exactly what software needs to be deployed, what patches can be deployed. And then I want to return control of that security policy, centrally managed back to the IT teams or back to the analysts or security teams, so that now we can have a standardized tagging policy implemented by developers. We only have application teams in lines of business or departments within an agency that are now only responsible for describing their workload programmatically in AWS with tags, with native functionality, in a standardized way prescribed by the organization. And now we can assign policy based on the way that the developer described their EC2 instance without IT having to go look at it, inventory it, baseline it. We can have all of this run programmatically as instances are deployed in, again, an incredibly repeatable fashion. We can leverage APIs to create these security policies and to create the tasks which automatically assign these security policies to workloads as new accounts are provisioned and as new projects are created on the fly.
So where do we go from here? Hopefully some of the things that we've talked about resonate with you. In our pilot program we've done with several large customers, professional services was here to help. We helped guide a pilot program which helped create an entire web interface to orchestrate a familiar interface for the different layers of an organization. And we engage a lot of professional services in order to help facilitate all the newest APIs that AWS has to offer into a solution that works for a very large commercial customer. So we encourage you to reach out to your sales rep if you want help in helping design this type of system that can make it very easy to scale out in a familiar interface that makes sense for your organization and is very familiar to the way they do things natively. We encourage people to take a lot of the principles that we've taught in order to build your own governance at scale solution by looking at the 3 principles that we've discussed today, right? You need to be able to do account management at scale, programmatically be able to create accounts and approve those accounts and assign budgets to those accounts, all through programmatics, kind of removing all the manual processes that you may or may not have today. Very important piece of this. We worked with a small company in order to do this for a pilot. It's called Cloud Tamer by Stratus Solutions. And this is the one company that we worked with very intimately to pilot this entire pattern out to customers to actually demonstrate that it works. So we encourage you to either build or look to the APN partners to actually help build this for you. Just want to let you know there's lots of resources out there to help you with this approach, and we are always here to talk about it and take you on this journey as you scale out into the cloud.
Critically, you cannot stop at just provisioning AWS services this way. It is absolutely essential to extend that across your entire operations tool stack, whether that's repeatedly building management planes for each project or centralized shared services design. It's very, very important to the organizations that we've worked with that have been successful at scaling this type of pattern to ensure that partner solutions on top of your infrastructure also meet those requirements to be programmatically deployed, programmatically provisioned, to be audited remotely from other systems. If we're building an infrastructure to help you manage and report on your environment, and then still have to go to 3 other partners' websites or consoles to get information about that environment, then we've lost massive amounts of the benefit of trying to drive to this design pattern, where we're able to programmatically define, provision, audit, and report against an environment at scale in a repeatable way. If you're looking at tools and you don't see the easy way to start talking to that API, if you're looking at a configuration management platform and you don't see where you can easily start to stand up the management stack and then programmatically deliver any agents to EC2 instances or connections to inventory management, or how these products hook up to AWS's API endpoints to deliver integration capabilities, start talking to those vendors and start talking to the AWS solution architects teams to find out, is it available for this solution? Do we need to dig a little bit deeper? Or do I need to look at something a little bit different to be able to fit into this model for defining my organization? Security and compliance tools, configuration management tools need this type of visibility parity to what we're creating with AWS in order for this model to really provide the maximum value for organizations. We talked a couple of times about the enterprise accelerators, the quick starts from AWS. There are several of these out there, and just in case you're not familiar, I want to spend a little bit time talking about the NIST High Impact Quick Start on AWS. Something Brett and I worked on and delivered a presentation on last year, actually. And this is really, really exciting. As much time as I spent talking to customers about automation in provisioning, especially security tools, it's really, really wonderful to meet a team that was as excited and near fanatical about automation and repeatability as I was and as the deep security team is. So what the enterprise accelerators are is this is a CloudFormation template that you can launch yourself directly from the AWS Quick Start page or go download from a public GitHub location and customize to your needs. What this is going to give you is either a prototype or a baseline for repeatably deploying controls in a sample application in AWS. The NIST High Quick Start deploys a WordPress application, an isolated application VPC, highly available with elastic load balancers and a 3-tiered architecture. Maybe your application looks like WordPress, maybe it doesn't. So you can use this as a prototype and say, yep, this is an application. What's really important for you if you're going to use this as a baseline is you have config turned on, we have CloudTrail turned on, we have logging policies turned on, we have storage retention policies for S3 buckets turned on. And these are all controls in code that you can copy into your own templates. You can take the template and rip out the application VPC if you don't need it. And we also deploy a shared services VPC that contains deep security, it contains our Bastion hosts, again, delivered in a highly available configuration with CloudWatch alarms and config rules turned on, integration SNS for notifications, so you have an example to build upon or to leverage. Steal code, won't bother us a bit, no copyright on any of it that's going to prevent you from borrowing the code, and start to look at how your organizations can repeatably deploy this type of infrastructure with native AWS tools.
Yeah, and just think about taking the whole baselining of accounts, using the enterprise accelerators, and then creating the web app or the orchestration layer to automatically do that, to create accounts and then baseline them through automation. So that every one of your accounts is consistently configured before it actually goes over to developers. It provides a lot of value add from a developer standpoint because they don't have to configure everything for themselves. But more importantly, you can have a lot of confidence as you scale out and as you create the programmatics to create accounts and push down these secure configurations that they're done repeatedly every time. And once again, the quick starts will give you a good start in that. So we encourage you to customize these quick starts and then put an orchestration layer like we've shown you using governance at scale, in order to deploy these things 1, 100, or even up to 1,000 times. So please think about these things as you go forward, as you scale out into AWS. Some additional resources we wanted to put up here. Everything that we have, if you want to build your own governance at scale, you can go to our API documentation, right? If you want to create a web app that incorporates this hierarchy that I talked about, you can build it for yourselves. All the documentation is out there. You can talk to the solutions architects on some of the best practices. You can talk to our group about how other agencies are actually doing it. We do have workshops that we do run around this area that talk about how you automate compliance using these types of familiar ideas that we talk about here at Governance at Scale. We do them primarily a couple times a year. And if you want to learn more about the APN solution that we created for a very large public sector customer that incorporates all of the aspects that we talked about throughout this presentation, the website is there, and you can learn more information on how maybe that solution may work for you.
You notice a ton of parity on this slide, probably. We're really looking every day in the deep security team to help customers consume security services in their environment the same way they consume services from AWS. So I want you to have this same well-documented, publicly hosted access to our API documentation that you would find with the AWS documentation. I want you to be able to go to our GitHub, public GitHub repository and look at sample code for one-off orchestration and management, design patterns for how to talk to the deep security management plane, how to get inventory of your systems, how to look at the status of your systems, how to manage policy on those systems, how to programmatically deploy additional protection, to modify your protection, or programmatically deploy additional automated tasks in your environment. Of course, for more information on deep security, definitely please look us up at trendmicro.com/AWS. This is the home for lots of our articles from our solution architects, learnings from time we've spent with our customers, the types of projects we've been able to deliver together, and some best practices certainly around how we deploy the deep security platform in AWS and how to provide the maximum security and compliance enforcement for your EC2 workloads. Getting close on time here. I want to thank Brett for hanging out for sure. I definitely want to thank all of you for coming out. I know it's probably a little bit quiet after lunchtime, and definitely appreciate you hopefully staying awake in the room. As we get close, and I understand certainly in this summit environment for sure, not necessarily anyone might want to grab a mic and put their questions up on public, but Brett and I will be hanging out here for a few minutes before anybody has to run off to the next session. If there's any questions, please feel free to come up and say hi.
If you have any questions, please take it offline. We'll be around for a little while. But remember, take a lot of these concepts, and as you scale into AWS and you need to strategize on how to manage AWS at scale, when you're thinking about how do I automate all of the things that are important to my organization, go back to some of the principles that we've talked about and formulate a plan around them. Because we feel that if you take these principles and you enable them in your organization, it'll give developers the speed that they need and the agility they need to be successful, but also provide the visibility, the control, and security that the leadership needs in order to feel confident in going to the cloud. So once again, we want to thank you for coming and enjoy the rest of your summit.